Welcome to our Fireside chat about ERP transformations. We are here today to talk to you about how data can be an integral part to your ERP work. And so this Fireside chat is a group of my colleagues and I coming to share with you some best practices and lessons learned along the way. Now, there's a lot of familiar names on the call, but if we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. For San Francisco Partners, or FSFP, is a woman-founded and led enterprise data governance consulting firm with more than 16 years of experience working with some of the world's most notable organizations to transform data value into measurable business value. We work with organizations in a variety of industries, and my colleagues and I, every day, we are partnering with organizations to establish and mature their data capabilities. I'm Becky, like I said, I'm a principal consultant and I lead our organizational change management practice. I'm moderating today's event, and we've got an expert lineup of folks. So first we have Sarah Rasmussen. She is our Calibra practice lead and an engagement partner. Rachel Thompson is a senior metadata analyst. Victoria Markley, Senior Master Data Management Consultant, and Gretchen Burnham, Delivery Excellence Principal Consultant. Also, Nellie McBride, Engagement Partner. And so, Gretchen, I gave just a little bit of a snippet of an intro. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the topic today?
Absolutely. It's actually an exciting topic and one of my favorites. So I'm really excited to get to chat about this today. We're here to talk about everything ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning tools, right? This is a technology that really can revolutionize how an organization's core business functions. It's really about centralizing processes, centralizing the data into one coordinated set, suite of software, maybe software as a service even, to really be able to have our processes flow from one to another much more seamlessly than they have in the past. So each component is designed to seamlessly integrate with the others and really be able to enable data sharing across the process flow as well. This really is used to tackle an organization's administrative and operational functions usually, and with an idea of really getting to a much more efficient, process for the organization and more efficient enterprise oversight.
This is the most digitally transformative opportunity for everyone in your organization to become data-driven. Companies spend massive amounts of money on implementing an ERP to drive value, efficiency, and productivity for the business.
Absolutely. But, we've seen the challenges and sometimes the travesties that happen when the processes and the rules about how the data should flow are mismanaged. I just want you to take a moment and think about this data, all the critical data that operates every aspect of your business, the way really how you define your business, all of it goes into and out of this program. And often data is actually an overlooked an almost forgotten part of an ERP implementation. When you don't get the data right, what's the cost?
The cost really is in resources across the board, internal resources, external resources. There are downstream and connected costs. It can even affect your reputation if a launch goes poorly. So additional costs can relate from things like release delays, conversion issues, reporting challenges, other costly mistakes.
It's absolutely fair, Becky. Great call outs. I think, it can be really daunting. The data part of it, it's a lane of the overall implementation that many organizations don't pay attention to right up at the front of their implementation journey. So sometimes an organization comes to this late, hopefully doesn't get forgotten about entirely. If you've ever been part of an ERP migration or an implementation, we get it. We've all been through those as well and really are familiar with the kind of typical experiences that many organizations have.
And it doesn't have to be a nightmare. Tackling this with a mature, sustainable data capability is how you will be able to reach that digital transformation that I talked about a minute ago. Realizing the value of your ERP investment Data capability is how we refer to all the pieces of our modern data governance framework. We think about how to bring these together to mature a data organization. And so our colleague Janine is going to flip over to our modern data governance framework. And I'm hoping, Gretchen, you can talk about this. You always do such a great job.
Absolutely. Again, so many of my favorite topics today. So Becky mentioned a data capability. And what do we mean by data capability? And it's really this whole circle I would think of as kind of most globally around building a data capability. There's a lot of pieces within this, a lot of kind of specific capabilities. And that can be from mastering the key data of your organization, managing data quality, being able to really manage your data and how it flows on a day-to-day basis. How do you handle compliance and regulatory needs? How do you help people understand the data and make it available for reporting and analytics? And with all of those things as well, how do you capture all of that good, fantastic knowledge about your information in an ERP, the knowledge that happens during development, the knowledge that happens throughout the process of running your business, and make sure that that information is available for your group to use. So those are a lot of the capabilities we kind of see towards the outside of the wheel, but really thinking about a really important piece here is the connective tissue of governance. And I think that's a key piece of how you unite all these different specific chunks of the world into a unified whole that helps you get to trusted data. Now, I know that when a lot of people hear data governance, they think about something really heavy and bureaucratic and very rigid that limits an organization. But in our experience and in our way of thinking, governance doesn't have to be that. It can be a service to the organization. Really, when I look at all of these things and everything about data governance, I think about bringing the right people to the table who already have authority, who are already key decision makers in your organization, bringing them to the table to make predictable and transparent decisions about data. And that ability to get those right people together, make those good decisions, that's how you get decisions that stick. And that's one of the most important things that an ERP implementation really needs, is the ability to stick the landing on their data decisions.
Absolutely. And we've worked with different clients at varying stages of their ERP implementation and their data capability maturity journeys. We've learned a lot of lessons about how to get better results faster. And so today we're going to share some specific examples of how FSFP, we've supported teams to apply some of these broader level best practices. One more thing I should say by way of an intro. Oh, thanks, Janine. Questions. We are happy to respond to everyone's questions. There's a lot of content in our conversation today. And so we ask that you send your questions to the chat during the event. We'll field them and answer them at the end of the presentation. Now, should we run out of time to address all of your great questions, you'll also be provided with some contact information to follow up with our team. Please feel free to capture that information at the end of the fireside chat, or you'll be able to note our names as well, and we'll be happy to get back to you. So now I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Nellie, who's going to talk about some of the things that people are seeing in ERP transformations.
Thank you, Becky and Gretchen. Great introduction. So we're going to get started with our first question on the panel. And it's really about what are the top challenges and problems that we see today with companies that we're working with and in general in the industry working on ERP transformation initiatives. Gretchen, do you want to get us started?
Absolutely. What's the top problem we see? Fundamentally, the thing that I see all the time is that data is considered too little, too late, and from a really limited perspective. And I think that that's really critical. It's an ERP implementation. Generally, you get your folks in there and you start to work on it, and there's a lot of focus on the process and the technology, getting the integrations up and running, a lot of process redesign for sure. And that's really important. But I think there's an assumption that the data is just going to magically fall into line. And it's not magic, and it won't. It might fall in line within the ERP, but that broader perspective of how that data is going to really land in your organization, that does not happen by accident. And as a matter of fact, if current environment is fragmented, that's just proof that it doesn't happen by accident, because otherwise it would just have magically happened for you. So an ERP doesn't generally cover 100% of an organization's operations. And so even if the data is doing great within the ERP, really thinking about those ripple effects. What other systems need to be adjusted to accommodate the ERP data and changes to the data model? How does the day-to-day vocabulary of your organization change with the data coming out of the ERP? And vocabulary changes are part of culture change as well, and can be tremendously difficult to do successfully. And so I think it's really important that the big data picture for your organization is given equal priority with process redesign and technical integration. And that's really critical to make sure you can realize the value of your ERP investment. What happens if we don't do this? I have one really alarming story. This is not from my FSFP time. This is something that I encountered before my FSFP career started. But there was a really large retailer. They attempted a major geographic expansion. And with that, they thought, we're just going to go in clean. We're going to do this fresh with all fresh systems, fresh data. We're going to do this right from the ground up, including a big, massive ERP. They were moving so fast and so focused on kind of process and system stuff that data decisions didn't happen in a conscious way. And especially the thought of like, a lot of stuff we're like, oh, those are really small little decisions. Those will just happen. We'll be fine. We all know what we're doing, right? And honest to goodness, they didn't. If I think about things like actual tactical standards for product master data didn't get handled. And y'all, they had such data quality issues. I'm not even gonna lie about this. When they went live to start distribution, only 30% of their product master data was okay. 70% of their data had massive data quality issues. So all of these things that happened during the build phase, all of a sudden they were going live and all of that kind of thing, right? So just huge issues. And it's not the data wasn't the only challenge that was faced there, but it did cause a ton of friction. So many examples of data causing huge friction. In the end, that geographic expansion failed completely, and largely because of the system view of these systems not functioning together and therefore not being able to move product out into their stores and get it sold to customers. They lost in 1 year. Their after-tax loss was $4.1 billion, which just sent a shiver down my spine. When I think about that story, it's worst case scenario, obviously, but I think about all the points during that journey where data could have been considered and wasn't. And like, really, how do we actually get better? And this is a thing that I know myself and my colleagues think about is how do we pick up data wherever we are along the journey and help move it forward? Sarah, can you share your experience about some of your clients and how they've been able to do that?
Yeah, and Janine, if you would bring up slide 5, that would be great. Is it the next one? With the different types of implementation. So thank you, Gretchen. Yeah, we want to talk about the risks that you as an organization can try to avoid. And if you're encountering them, then course correct. So one really key issue that we see and risk that is brought forward with ERP transformations is they're too technical and process driven. And regardless of those the types of ERP implementations that you're seeing on the screen, many times they're driven and led by IT. And to take it one step further, a lot of times we are working with organizations that have outsourced their ERP transformations to large SIs or technology implementation partners. So thinking about the promise of an ERP in streamlining your organization, bringing in out-of-the-box functionality that's within the ERP solution, and doing things like standardizing your chart of accounts. These are all really big value adds that are supposed to help with the original intent of the work, but missing the people that know the data, not having business at the table to talk through what's the history of the prior ERP implementations, or what is the work that they do on the day-to-day basis, and what type of data do they use to meet their everyday needs. This is a huge miss. It introduces a lot of risk. And what this means is that the business-driven outcomes that is the promise of the ERP implementation are easily lost in translation, and it can put the whole program at risk. So now thinking, in preparing for this, we were talking about the impact of getting data governance involved on an ERP initiative and when that should be. So can you, I'm going to pivot to Nellie, and I want you to share about how we as a DG consulting firm get brought in to reduce this risk.
Thanks, Sarah. I think it comes back to really one of the key points Gretchen made earlier is the accountability around making decisions in this process is really important. And I think that's where, either your existing data governance process and capability, or building that in the context of the ERP program can be really important to align people and processes from a business perspective with this, largely IT driven program, which is typically how ERPs, come about, to Sarah's point. And, it's really important is to make sure that the framework and the governance process for those decisions is in place to drive the ERP, to make sure that the decisions around how the data is defined, who's accountable for that data, both in the process of building the program, building the ERP system, but really for the longevity of the business are in place, and looking at and thinking about upstream and downstream impacts for those data decisions, because oftentimes an ERP program is very, siloed to some degree because they are aggressive timelines and it is a very big scope. But thinking about the systems that are upstream from a sales as well as an HR perspective, and downstream, especially reporting and analytics, is really important. The technology that is built from an ERP perspective, it's built from a process and technology perspective, but not necessarily about the data. And that's why this is so important. You can't define the technology process, the technology requirements and the process requirements without thinking about the data. And it's really important to think about and ensure that the data is considered along with that technology solution from the very beginning through testing all the way to implementation. And so those are some of the examples we'll talk about next. It's critical to have the business users from a stewardship as well as the governance and decision-making perspective involved throughout the entire process. An active data council throughout this process is really important. We've implemented and worked with clients before to bring that into the picture. And that's one of the most important pieces, as well as stewardship and making sure that the decisions around defining those master data elements and the domains and then how they're going to be managed throughout is really important. So I think next we're going to hear from Rachel, has a great example of this, and we'll talk through that example and get on to some of our next points.
Yeah, thanks, Nellie. So just kind of a real life example that I've seen. I had an engagement where the client was a large, well-known healthcare organization, and they were more towards the beginning of their ERP implementation. And they had been working with a, big SI firm who was helping them to instill the technology and integrate that. And they've been working with them for some time at this point. And really when the project started, that partner for them was great, bringing in the business. They were very aligned on those needs and those requirements. But as that timeline kind of snuck up on everybody, that's where they started to kind of see a shift. And for this implementation, finance, HR, and supply chain, they really were the champions of the data. They were asking for help. They were going to the organization and saying, we need someone who can partner with us to make sure that things are not missed. And so that's where, they reached out to us. And And even though that initial interaction was so great and the business was at the table, they knew how important that was and wanted to ensure that they didn't go through go live kind of feeling alone in this way. And so by seeing those gaps, they knew after they kind of came to us that we were understanding the complexities, the different implications and risks that those gaps could cause if not addressed. And so one of the biggest pieces they wanted to address was a reporting inventory that they had gathered together about over 16,000 reports and analytics that were downstream, that the data really had not been addressed. And so it was really vital to understand, how, for example, that financial data was being used and consumed across other business areas, not just in finance, not just in, HR. And so even though those other areas were not considered in scope for the, ERP implementation, there were needs for those requirements to be met. And so scope is really tricky because you don't want to cast too wide of a net. You don't want to have extraneous resources on a project, but, when it's too narrow, some of those downstream teams and their data needs and requirements can be neglected. And so this client was really great in that they were championing the data, and they really had the foresight to reach out and make sure that these pieces were addressed before, the green light of go live.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you for that example, because I think that's the perfect example of why these ripple effects are so important. And, it's the double-edged sword from an ERP implementation perspective. Of course, you need to keep it focused, but getting the right folks involved from a data perspective is really critical. Next, we're going to talk about, why does this matter? There's some very important reasons why paying attention to the data is so critical to the success, and ultimately really de-risking the delivery, which will minimize cost, potential time delays, and other risks to the business. So Victoria, do you want to talk to us about data migration and some of the experiences we've seen there?
I would love to. So there's really kind of two things that I notice most frequently when it comes to the data migration architecture. That I used to be on the SI side, so I've been on the implementation of these massive technology engagements, and we are always, the first thing we go in and do is focus on business discovery and requirements, and making sure that we are building a technology that is going to support the business. What is almost always lacking is that data discovery and looking at the data requirements, the data modeling, and the data architecture. Frequently, when you're doing these ERP implementations, you're moving from one ERP to the next. Sometimes you're upgrading, staying in the existing ERP, but maybe it's a massive upgrade, it's a big jump. Rarely are the architectures of those two, even if it's the same technology, it's still not going to be the same data architecture. So you really need to take a step back and look at what is that data modeling and data architecture needed to support that business. So now we have a technology that supports the business, but also data that supports the business as well. The other thing, once we have an architecture, if we've correctly focused on that during the discovery phase, the second piece that I see all the time missing is the actual data migration activities. So you have to understand how the data needs to transform to fit into that new architecture. So, the ETL, or extract, transform, load, there's whole technologies just for that piece of the puzzle. And that is just as critical. So we've built the architecture, but if we don't take the time to transform that data, either values, whatever it is, to make sure that it actually is working for the business, you're going to see problems downstream. I've got a fun little anecdote and story of something that's happening right now with one of my clients, where they're hitting this exact same scenario. They've spent over a year on release 1. It's going to be a 3-release ERP implementation. For release 1, towards the end, it was close to launch, right around now. A couple months ago, they started doing their test data loads, and all of a sudden realized there was a lot of problems with some of the way they configured and customized this ERP, because the data just wasn't going to work. And they found out about it pretty late in the game, because they had already started their test migrations pretty late in the game, because it was kind of an afterthought. Oh, the data's in the current system, it'll move it to the new system, it's going to be fine. So what's happened with that is now they've delayed their initial relaunch by 3 months. We all know what that means. We now have change orders all over the place for their SIs, for FSFP, for all of their consultants that are there supporting them. So there's extra costs there. There's also the unforeseen costs now for their internal resources, because they can't move on to what they were supposed to be doing. Everything's being reprioritized. We know that release 1 is being delayed. The subsequent releases are also going to be delayed. So there's this massive downstream impact. And another thing, I think Becky mentioned at the very beginning, brand deterioration is real. So because we are one of their vendors, we're getting updates that, hey, our AP or accounts payable and accounts receivables, we're changing systems. Here's what's going to impact you. And then they're having to go out and reach out to every single one of their vendors and customers, announcing the delay, because they've already, announced that there was going to be a change already. So that brand deterioration is real. So that's a little bit about the architecture and the data migration and putting data in. Rachel, can you talk to us a little bit about the consumption, the downstream impacts of that ERP data?
Yeah, so I was kind of mentioning earlier, with the downstream reporting, how that was not considered. We also see this a lot with reference data. So the new ERP can be that source for that reference data. But how is that being, propagated downstream and used? And so let's take, for example, a job code. A job code can be entered into the new ERP, and that's, the gold standard, the new source. However, if that entire data journey is not considered, you might not have the proper integrations to automatically consume that data downstream. And I've been seeing with the client I was referencing earlier, there's a lot of manual entry now to align those different systems. So if there is a new job code or an updated job code, that manual entry and those processes have to be really, really tight and on point. We're all aware that more manual entry open up more opportunities for error. It's just human error, timing, if a communication doesn't go through. So, making those processes really tight, making sure that you're prepared for them, and really being able to, establish automatic processes, and that consumption is really, really important. And then likewise, if you're, translating terminology is really important. So say, you want to know that you're talking about apples to apples. If job code is the new term in the ERP, but it used to be position code, it's, absolutely essential that there's an emphasis on, education and data literacy, and making sure that everyone is aware of the new terminology, those definitions, and how these pieces are being used. So that could, cause breaks in tools if other teams are not aware. It really seems like common sense, to translate these things in this terminology. But with everything that can be going on in an implementation, some people do end up heads down and kind of working in silos. And so that's where communication can get missed, and some confusion, and, even rework, which is always a rough one to kind of take.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you. Those are all really good points. So, we talked about data architecture. We talked also about, Victoria touched on migration and conversion issues and requirements. Rachel, you talked about reference data, which is huge because there's big impacts outside of an ERP around reference data. Not only consumption of the reference data, but managing and governing the reference data for sure. And then certainly the data literacy component. So I think those are all, definitely large challenges to think about. The next thing we're going to talk about here is how to avoid these problems, right? What does it take to really think ahead of time, or even during an ERP implementation where some of these things might have been missed? How do you either strategize initially to build a program to avoid these pitfalls, or you come in kind of in flight, if you will, and triage and course correct? So Gretchen, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started, and we'll really talk about best practices.
Sure, absolutely. There's definitely themes in the best practices for sure. And the most important thing from my perspective, there's again a lot of different pieces of this, but wherever you are right now, start looking at your data, right? Don't delay another day. In an ideal world, you start at the very beginning, right? You're able to build in a data perspective right from the get-go. if you're already started on your journey, it's not too late, start today, right? What we're showing on the screen right now is a way of looking at kind of a data governance operating model. And the idea here is really thinking about how to bring those people together. How do you get the right people together to make sets of data decisions and make sure that the data is really going to work within an organization? So start as soon as you can. And some of the things to consider, like if you haven't yet started your ERP implementation, you're like, okay, great, I want to get a data track going. First questions to consider: who gets to make data decisions within the ERP? And how do those decisions that you're making for data interact with the process and technology tracks within the ERP implementation, right? This kind of support, being able to make decisions that come up within the ERP implementation itself, that is something you will need throughout your program, right? Even up till after you go live, you still need to be able to make data decisions within that thing. Do we need to add a reference value? What's working, what's not working? So that's a really important part. How are you going to serve the ERP implementation with decision making? And then along with that, who gets to make data decisions for the larger enterprise context, right? And that can include things like, what is your organization's overall master data architecture and design? What master data needs exist outside of the ERP, and how will those be served? I think, by the way, a lot of times people assume that the ERP will be the master data repository. That's not actually generally the primary function of the ERP itself, although many of them have master data management tools, but thinking about the big picture of the data. If you're going to be doing something with processing customer orders in your ERP, what needs to happen in your customer relationship management tool in order to make those two play together nicely in the future, right? For instance. And then how are you going to keep track of all of these data decisions and discussions that happen within the program and outside of the program, and share those with the organization? And those can be really important high-level strategic decisions that are being made about what information is going to happen where, what processes will happen where. So big decisions, and they can be very, very tactical, right? What is the order of dimensions on your product? That is a very tactical in the overall realm of things, but if you don't get it right, it will have impacts later. You need to be able to document that and share that knowledge out with your organization over time. And then, I think back to something that Victoria was mentioning about the data migration and data testing. How are you going to support data migration and data testing? Because if it's only within the ERP program, you don't quite have all the perspectives you need. You need to be able to bring in additional perspectives from beyond that and test the data, not just within the ERP, but in your larger enterprise context as well. So, these are all some kind of key considerations to be thinking about whenever you get to start your data track, hopefully right at the beginning, but giving data an equal voice right from the get-go and just reduce churn for your whole implementation. And churn costs money, so reducing churn is really a good thing, I think. From there, Victoria, I think you've been thinking about another best practice.
I do, and you perfect transition, because you one of the last things you said was data needs to have an equal voice, and that's my best practice. That is it. I think we've all heard the old adage, people, process, and technology when it comes to implementation engagements. There's also one that's less known, but it's called PPTI, or People, Process, Technology, and Information. I think PPTI is better, but I still think it misses the mark, and we need to reconsider our focus here. So I'm a very visual person, and visually I think of data, process, technology as the three legs of our tripod, with people being that tabletop. So people span everything, that they're the most critical thing that exists. But our leg stools are the data, process, technology. And if you don't have the equal weight and equal focus on all three of those, your tabletop's going to get a little jittery and not be as solid as we really want it to be. So I think when I also want to kind of clarify, when we're saying the data, what does that mean? Because I think sometimes people just think it's data governance. I talked about data migration. to me, there's 5 different things that are kind of all need to be considered with the equal amount of weight. It's the requirements, the data modeling, the data governance definitely is there, operational models, stewardship, those types of things, and then also that data cleansing and migration piece of the puzzle. So, I've had engagements where the dedicated work stream, there were people dedicated on the requirements and the migration, but they weren't focused on the other things. Or then, one I came in and they were just wanted us to focus on governance and operating models, which is great. I mean, still they're focusing on data, just not the whole piece of the puzzle. I have a recent engagement I've been working on where they do have a focus of each, but it's the people's second job. So, you have your SIs, their full-time job is that implementation. But we often see that when it comes to data, we're like, we're just going to give this as, this team, but it's their secondary job that we think we're okay because we have people focused on it. But as soon as something goes wrong, that it's going to get deprioritized because something else is going to take, priority over it, the data. It often happens. So I think that's really the key thing is making sure you have a dedicated team with an equal focus, just like you do on the business processes and the technology implementation. That data work stream has to have that equal level of importance.
And so I'm glad that you really mentioned having dedicated resources, but I think in those cases too, where you don't have those dedicated resources and teams, my kind of best practice in this is really to focus on the incremental build of stewardship, as well as data literacy and data governance. In those cases where people might not have as much time to make this their priority, that's where I actually have a lot of fun introducing these, concepts into these teams and really find a lot of ways to provide value to these teams, but you don't want to bring it on all at one time. You don't want to overwhelm anyone. And so that's where you really have to meet everybody where they're at. And so, in my most recent client that I've been working with, there's different maturity levels of stewardship teams, and that's okay. And those other teams can help to bring those teams along on the ride. So that's the really fun part of it too, is it's kind of this learning experience, and it really encourages, a collaboration amongst the different data domains where they can help build each other up. They can help bring each other along for the ride. Different ideas can foster, even quicker stewardship later on. You can build this into your process. And so that cross-team collaboration is just really exciting to see. And when it actually happens, it's just I know we mentioned magic, things don't happen magically earlier, but I really just enjoy that part, seeing the client realize that by putting the data first, stewarding the data, they are providing value to themselves as individuals, their teams, and then the organization as a whole. So it's not a selfish, endeavor that they're on. It's really going to benefit everybody in this organization. And it's just that part where you really get to connect and kind of see what everybody's going through and really try to provide that value that at the end of the day is, why everybody's trying to work towards that goal.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. So I think, just to really wrap this up, we talked about these best practices, right? Which, Gretchen hit on some of the keys around who's going to make the decisions around data. Why is that operating model so important? Why is the architecture so important? Victoria, you talked about data as being one of the critical pieces of the three-legged stool. If you think about data, technology, and processes, which every ERP program has those work streams. And, it is unfortunate that sometimes the data work stream is under-resourced and there's not enough time to do it. And then Rachel talked about a lot of the importance of stewardship and organizational change management and how important it is to build and grow incrementally to bring your organization along. And I think one of the common themes of all of these is do not underestimate the amount of time and energy that should be put into the data and the reward and really management of risk that it will produce in the program over time. And I think, that's, one of, so I'll just sort of wrap it up with that, because I think, unfortunately, although we're always happy to help, we oftentimes get brought in at, the 5th or 6th hour, and in some cases, the 10th or 11th hour, when we're on a 12-hour time clock and gosh, we're going to release in a couple months, and we just realized we have a big problem with the data. And I think sort of what we've tried to outline here is a really proactive approach at regardless of what stage you're at. What are the most important considerations and how to really bring this together in terms of a data work stream that can enable and drive data capability as an organization for sure, but really de-risk and help deliver a very high quality ERP program. So I'm going to just wrap it up and turn it over to Gretchen, and then we're going to Q&A in just a minute here.
Sure. I always enjoy hearing all of the stories from my colleagues because I think each of us gets to see this from slightly different perspectives and sees it with a slightly different lens. And so I always find that so fascinating. I mean, some of these are definitely cautionary tales for sure of like, oh gosh, that was probably not so good. But we absolutely have seen successes as well with organizations who do focus on the data and really put resources to it, follow those best practices. So really thinking about what are the problems that you need to solve, how do you think about data in that larger enterprise context? These things I think are just super critical, and it's fun to hear all of these stories. So I always enjoy that part of it.
The dreaded mute button. As I've been listening to this today and hearing from all of you, your stories, I truly appreciate the emphasis on best practice and collaboration and knowledge sharing, because that's what this is all about. Implementing an ERP is hard. We know that. But by collaborating, working together, we can help to streamline that process and make it less painful along the way, right? By emphasizing a holistic perspective on data, making sure that data is brought into the conversation early and often to reduce churn later on, and then also to drive collaboration, incrementally build out and meet people where they're at. As people are doing this work, helping them go step by step is really going to take you forward quite some way. And so with that, that is the end of our fireside chat, but I know that the questions are always welcome, and Nellie's been keeping track of that on the side. So I'm going to transition it over to Nellie to talk about questions and wrap us up.
Yeah, so surprisingly, I've not seen a lot of questions, which just I doubt we answered all of them. So I think if you have questions out there, please feel free to, put them in the chat. And we also have some information here that Janine is sharing about how to get in touch with us. I realize some of your questions may be very specific to your situation, and you may not want to bring them up here, and that's fine. So certainly reach out to us. I did see one question, which is if we're sharing the recording in the deck, and the answer is yes. So we'll make this information available to anyone that signed up for the chat, and it'll be available on our website, and Janine will kind of help us out with that. But please feel free to follow up with us if there's specific questions. If you have an ERP that you're thinking about, or your organization is in the midst of, like we talked about, the 5th, 6th, or even 11th hour, and there may be some specific data challenges that you need some help with, we're happy to help. Earlier the better, as we like to say, to think about kind of what the data opportunities are to build that capability up to de-risk your ERP process. But we would love to hear from you guys. Any other questions out there? Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, I would just say huge thank you to everyone that helped us present and facilitate today. Becky, Gretchen, Rachel, Sarah, Victoria, and Janine. Thank you guys for all the facilitation and the great examples. We'll be following up with everyone today to provide the information and welcome any follow-ups you might have.
We do have one question that came in.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I see that now. How do we access impact of business processes? Great question. I'll throw that to Gretchen or Victoria. Either one of you guys want to jump on that one?
I'll start, and then I know Victoria, you'll have a lot to say in this one as well. I think one of the things to understand is that especially if you're working with a system integrator, they will actually put a lot of focus on your business processes. And that is because that's actually where they tend to put all of the implementation focus is on process redesign. And so I think that that's really important. Being able to tie your data to your business processes and understand what data is being used where, I think is super critical. This is one of those things that I think about using a data catalog to help really be able to help manage that for the whole organization, right? That's one of my favorite use cases for a data catalog. But I think being able to really dive in there and understand how changes of business process are going to change the data. Your system integrators will have a lot to say about that one, for one thing, but always think about what are the processes that aren't part of your ERP and making sure that that they're part of that as well. Victoria, what did I miss?
Yeah, no, that was great. I think what I would add on to that is it's very hard to assess the impacts to business process because it's inevitable there is going to be change to the business process. Nobody likes change. And I think that's another piece of this puzzle that we didn't really talk about in this fireside chat, but just change management. And that is a very heavy piece of this puzzle as well. That's great. We've got a technology, we've got the data. How do we, de-risk this going from the current system and process to the new system and process? There is disruption that's going to happen and there's going to be impact to the business. I think what's really important to figure out is what is good impact versus negative impact. And the things we want to be looking for is disruption to just day-to-day business operations. Are things easier or harder? And again, you won't know immediately because it's going to feel harder just because it's different. But that's the really things you'll want to start looking into once people are getting kind of the groove and where we understand how to do these changes. Are people being able to be doing things efficiently and getting the results they need? So those are the things you really want to start looking for once the disruption kind of died down a little bit.
Yeah, the last thing those are all great. The last thing I would add to that and what I've found helpful in this process is to think about, and this is what I think sometimes is not thought about in the business process redesign work that Gretchen talked about with SI partners, is the current state versus future state. Thinking about the data lifecycle compared to current state and future state can also be extremely impactful, because as you're trying to minimize and reduce business processes and drive efficiency, sometimes you can create data problems in that, right? And thinking about the data lifecycle for that future state can be really important. I see some additional follow-on questions you have, Diakar, that I think are great. And one of the pieces, one of your questions here was, can we do alignment of business processes to critical data elements? And I would say absolutely yes. And part of the reason I would recommend, or we think about looking at the data lifecycle next to the business process, is because it can be extremely helpful to think about not only what are the most important critical data elements, but what are the critical data elements that are changing in the future state, and to be extremely thoughtful and proactive about what are those changes, how are they going to be managed, and also the OCM component, or what organizational change management needs to happen across the organization to really drive that to success, right? And I think I'm gonna just look at the time here, 1:53. We've got about 7 minutes left. And let me back up really quick.
Can I jump on one additional question that's in there, Nellie?
Yes.
Which is about, is it worth it to check data quality before migration? Oh my gosh, yes, please. Please, please, please. You'll see lots of nodding happening here. As a matter of fact, it's actually imperative because you won't be able to do your data migration without having done some data cleansing up front. And that takes a whole lot of, data profiling and data discovery to really actually understand the legacy data that you're going to be migrating. So with that, the data quality requirements, that's a great time to be documenting data quality requirements, thinking about what your long-term data quality requirements might be, and really be working in that data to proactively get it as good as possible. And that is not just a technical thing either. That's not, some people like, okay, we'll have IT check the data quality. IT doesn't often know what quality means for a piece of data. You have to know what it means to the business in order to know if it's good. And so really, I think super important to be involving the business in those data cleansing and documenting your data quality expectations.
I'd also
Yeah,
like to
just-
add to that is, you know, as part of an ERP, it's called an ERP transformation. A lot of times this means a conversion of the data. So what Gretchen was talking about, making sure that the data is of quality, standardized, understood prior, but a lot of times with these new technologies, you're actually converting the data and it's going to look different. So having data quality practices, profiling in place, it's an opportunity to engage the business and have some collaboration and comparison and make sure as part of the coding and go live and testing that you have data quality right at the forefront.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that and just add on, it's actually, and Victoria, you can probably speak to this. It's actually one of the things we're doing with our clients right now is help them write their data quality rules and the data quality playbook for their ERP critical data elements in their master data domains for customer, vendor, and financial data. And all of those data quality rules are then being used in the testing and conversion process, as well as part of the education and OCM. So I don't know, Victoria, if you want to talk about that, but that's absolutely part of the approach that we would certainly advocate and bring to any customer in this process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The data quality rules and the data standards, there's no reason you can't get them documented. And again, don't just document what they are in the current system, but what should they be in the new system? I think that's, you got to, always think about what they should be, not what they are. And as soon as you determine what they should be, either we're changing because of the architecture is changing, or you're changing because it's just, you've realized there's some deterioration has happened over time. So there's no reason, once we know what those data quality rules are, you can't start resolving them in the old system even. It can be during migration, but it can be as early as do it now. Before you even start the migration, you can start cleansing the data. So it's never too early when it comes to, cleansing those pieces of the puzzle.
Also never too late.
Yeah.
Meaning you need to have them at some point. You definitely want them ideally before testing conversion, but yeah, a great question. And I think we're just about at time. Any other questions here you guys want to jump on? What I would also say is when we do the follow-up, we will plan on including the Q&A and some updated answers and some of the follow-up materials we provide. So great questions, Diakar. Anybody else want to chime in on any of these?
I would love to chime in on, another question that has come in about business processes and recommendations around domains that have disparate business processes using the same domain. Happens all the time. Every single domain, a master data domain, by its definition, is used by many different functions. And so, I think about customer and salespeople trying to build relationships with their customers versus your customer service and order processing who are trying to ship product, for instance, right? They have very different perspectives on the same set of information or the entities that information represents, right? So this is where I think about the power of enterprise data governance, right? When we talk about bringing the right people to the table, this is what we're talking about. If you can bring those people to the table together and say, this is what you need, this is what I need, what do you need? Let's bring that together. They might be closer than we think. There's going to be spots where they're not aligned. How do we meet everyone's needs? We make this data. It's possible to make it better, and it's possible to make it so that it meets needs of multiple functions, especially in the master data space. So this is why data governance for me needs to be an enterprise level activity, not always, deep into all of the different silos.
Yeah,
well, thank you
point.
so much, everybody, for your time and your insight. We really do appreciate the questions. Please feel free to snap that QR code or note Janine's email address. She'll make sure that your questions get routed appropriately, and then we'll follow up with any of the other questions that came in. So thank you so much for joining us today as part of this fireside chat. And if you need help with your ERP implementation, or you're just thinking about potentially doing an implementation and you want to bounce around some ideas, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to chat with you more about this topic. Thanks so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.